As you can see, I've placed a piece of glassine under my hand so I won't smear my painting. And now I'm using a stick of Giraud black pastel to add more darks to the shadow area of the wolf's face. Sometimes I use the edge of the stick to make hairs, and sometimes I use it flat on the end if I'm wanting a more solid application of pastel. But I do want to protect my pastel with the glassine paper. So I'm going to speed this up just a little bit. I'm continuing to use the flat end of the pastel. Now I'm going to work over on the other side of the wolf. You can see the dimension starting to develop. The face of the wolf is taking on a rounded appearance. Now I've switched to black new pastel. I'm using it on the sharp edge, one of the four edges, to make a fur-like texture by using strokes back and forth with the sharp edge of my pastel. Then I can turn it around and use the tip if I want to shade in particular areas. I'm drawing out little hairs from the eye. It's very dark in here. Now I've switched it back around to use the edge to get those nice sharp hairs. I'm not going to keep the black edge super sharp. I let it get kind of dull. But I'm still going, placing the strokes in the direction that the fur grows. Rubbing it in with my finger occasionally. So I've speeded it up a little bit now, still using the edge of that pastel, adding hair in the direction the hair grows. You can also see the blue tone that's on the base of the nose. That's from the 305 spruce blue that we applied earlier when we were doing the nose. So I'm adding some little tiny black hairs in that area. Now I'm adding some 704.5 medium gray and graying down the area some more using the end. I like to work on the end, especially when I'm working on the face. So I'm continuing to make it darker, adding the dark fur of the wolf. Here I'm using tile blue on the shadow side of the wolf, adding a little color variety there. That's number 415 on your color sheet. And I'm going to use the 305 spruce blue to add a little blue back down in that area too. It just adds a little color variation. Now I'm going back to the spruce blue to add some blue tone to the fur. And now I'm returning to the black on the edge, adding black fur in the darkest area of the wolf, going in the direction the fur grows. I don't make individual strokes. I generally let my stick go back and forth in my hand. It's a zigzag motion. Now I'm using the Cordovan 353 to add brown. I'm using the tips, so I'm just softly shading it in, not adding hair per se, just darkening it up with the brown color. I'm continuing to add brown around the eye, on the side of the nose, different areas on the face where I think it needs more brown. After adding a little gray to the background, I'm adding some brown with the Mars Violet into the ear area. Now I'm using the medium gray 704.5 to add more gray to that ear. I'm using the new pastel 209 deep warm gray to add some gray to the fur on the outside edge of the lower part of the wolf's face. After adding the gray, I'm using the 235 light blue new pastel to add a little blue to the hair right underneath the nose. And now I'm using the white pastel to add the highlights onto the trim that's on the blanket or pillow that's underneath the dog. So we're going to add the highlights right over the gray that we applied earlier. Here I'm using a light gray 249 light warm gray to add the hair underneath the nose on the wolf. Just short little strokes. As they're a little darker, a little more shaded, we may alter those later underneath the nose. Here I'm using the black charcoal pencil to clean up the edges of the nose where I might have gone over it with the pale gray so that it's nice and even. Now I'm using the 299 New Pastel on its edge to begin adding the final hairs onto the wolf's nose. They're short little hairs. They're going in various different directions on his nose, so I'm adding them one by one. Now I'm using my white charcoal pencil to add some short, brighter hairs to that area. Now I'm using my charcoal pencil, very sharp, to add a few black hairs back in to the white. I'm taking my time and being very careful where I place them. Now I'm using the sharp edge of my 235 light blue to place a few hairs on the nose. Switching back to the 299 New Pastel on its edge, and I'm adding hairs on the shadow side of the wolf's face. I'm carefully placing them. I want the most realistic effect I can get, and so I take my time putting each hair where it needs to go. I'm also using my charcoal pencil to go in between the light hairs as needed to add back in some darker hairs. And then I move back to the 299. I'm going to be using the 299 in the shadow area. I'm not going to use any lighter colors because it is in shadow. I'm continuing to add more hairs on the dark side with the 299 New Pastel, taking my time, carefully adding in the hairs and trying to be random with their placement. We don't want them to be all exactly the same. And now I'm going to add 249 New Pastel, the warm gray. It's just a little bit lighter. So I'm placing light, short hairs over the top of the longer hairs of the 299, going in the direction that the fur grows. Now I'm using my cordovan to add a few dark brown hairs into the white. I'm using that sharp edge again. This method takes patience, but it produces such beautiful results, so I encourage you to hang in there. Here I'm using the 209 dark warm gray to add a deeper color going up the nose. I'm using the tip, so I'm feathering it in. I'm not using the edge to make sharp hairs. I'm just adding some more gray color before I go back and add the lights. I've speeded things up a little bit now that you know the process. I'm continuing to add hairs with the light warm gray, the 299 cool gray, which is what I'm using now, and I'll use the black charcoal pencil to add black hairs, particularly out from the eye like I'm doing now. That just makes it look more realistic, helps the eye to sit down in there, and a few sharp whites with the white charcoal pencil. The hairs are very short in this area. Around the eye. As we work out of the eye up towards the forehead, the hairs will get longer. So now I'm beginning to add the longer hairs with a 299. Now I've switched to my 211 white, and I'm stroking the brightest hairs just above the wolf's eye. I'm taking my time, putting them in. As I come down the face of the wolf, I've switched to 211, placing the brightest and lightest hairs next to the gray ones we applied earlier. Now I'm using my white 211 to add the brightest hairs over the top of the nose. I've switched back now to the black Cretacolor pastel lead to add some sharp black hairs into the top of the nose. I place them very carefully, as you can see. Always going in the direction the fur grows. I've speeded things up a bit in this section. I'm still using the black lead pencil by Cretacolor, adding tiny black hairs. I'm going to add light hairs with some 299 new pastel, short little strokes. Place them randomly. You don't want them all the same or all in a row. Make sure it's going in the direction of the fur. I've switched back to using my 299 pastel, adding hair. Careful of the direction. This is a 249, adding some lighter hair on top of that. And using the 209 gray to create a better blend of between the lighter and the darker hairs. I'm adding those little tiny hairs on the side of the nose with the Cretacolor. And now I'm using the 211 white to add little tiny hairs, short little hairs. Now I've decided that I need to use my gray Rembrandt to tone down the brightness of the white. So I'm going over it lightly with the end. Now I'm going to use my sharp white charcoal pencil to add some bright hairs into the top of that nose. I'm going to speed things up a bit now. Here I am adding some hairs with a white pastel pencil. So I'll be switching back and forth between the 211 white, the 299 gray, the white pencil, and a black charcoal pencil to finish adding the hairs on the lower portion of the wolf's face. Now I'm going to use my 299 gray new pastel on the edges. You'll see that I use one edge and then I rotate it and use another edge. So I have 4 sharp edges. And so I rotate those edges until the pastel gets dull, and then I sharpen it on the sandpaper block. So I'm using those sharp edges to carefully draw the hair over the eye on the wolf and underneath the eye. I think it's important to note here I use the 299 underneath the eye because that's more of a shadowed area. So I don't want to use the white new pastel. I want to use the gray. I'm varying the strokes, varying the direction. They're rather short, so I want to keep them short, following the contour of the wolf's face, rotating my pastel as I need to get a sharp edge. So I'm just pulling out those little hairs. Now I'm going to switch to my 211 white and add a few bright white hairs underneath the eye. Rotating so I get a fresh edge to use. You can watch me just turn it around in my hand. Now using the sharp Cretacolor black pastel lead, I'm going to draw some sharp black lines down from the edge of the eyelid into this area under the wolf's eye. very thin, sharp lines. I'm using the end of my 727-7 blue gray to add shadow on that eye socket before I add hair over it. Now I'm going to use my 299 new pastel, the sharp edges, one of the sharp edges, rotating it in my hand to get another sharp edge, and draw the hair that's in the shadow area of that eye socket of the wolf. Always pulling the hair in the direction which it grows. Adding a few little black hairs with the Cretacolor as I go. And now I'm using my 211 white on the edge to add some fine white hairs. We're going to add brighter hairs over the eye, rotating it to get a sharp edge. I've speeded this last part up, but you can see I'm doing basically the same thing, alternating between the black Cretacolor, pastel lead, the white pencil, and the white new pastel. Adding a few bright hairs with the white and then using the Cretacolor to add black hairs back into it. So take your time adding your hairs. It'll be worth it. You'll have a beautiful, beautiful wolf. I've flipped my wolf back over to right side up, and I'm adding a few additional white hairs with my white charcoal pencil to his nose. I'm just doing those final little tweaks to get it just like I want it to. Be sure and take your time to add these little details. That's what makes a world of difference in your painting. So I'm putting in some hairs that are a few strays. They add a lot of interest to your painting. Here I'm going back to the black color to add a few more black hairs in between the white ones. I generally go back and forth between the white and the black in the final stages of the painting to get all those little hairs in the right place so it'll look exactly like I want it to. If you get tired, take a break and then come back and look at it. Always take a break if you get tired. And when you come back, you'll see new things you want to change, or maybe you like it just the way it is. Thank you for joining me for part 4 of Skye. Be sure and watch the next part 5 to finish up.